The thing about a preparedness mindset is that you are thinking into the future. And so if one of those scenarios happens, you've already mentally prepared in some sort of way for it. So you're not dealing with the shock. That's a place as an artist that I feel has a lot of potential, right, for engagement and for communication and bringing audiences along. When you're talking about realities, accepting that reality, right, I think has the potential to push us to do other things. It's great to hear about Canada Council, changing different ways around enabling the arts and building capacity in the arts in terms of the context of the climate emergency. It'll be interesting to see how artists step up.
Another episode of the Conscient podcast. I'm with Jen Rae, who's actually a Canadian, but she's in Australia this morning. Good morning, Jen.
Well, good morning. Thanks for having me, Claude.
Yeah, well, it's my pleasure. I've been reading about your work recently, and I've known about you, but we haven't met. So it's a pleasure to get to know you, especially now that there's so much more activity around art and climate change, and you've been working for many, many years, and in a way being prescient of the moment that's coming, if such a thing exists. But maybe you could just start by introducing yourself. We'll have a link to your bio, but just a quick overview of who you are, where you come from, and what you do.
Sure. I'm a practice-led researcher. I've been working at the intersection of, art and climate change. Gosh, seriously, since about 2005, 2006. But I did my first work in 2003. And over the course of time, I've really moved from sort of creating works that were about raising awareness to moving towards disaster preparedness. And that's where the body of my work has been since 2006. So, and then at the same token, I do a lot of community social cohesion projects in my community of Faulkner, which is north of Melbourne. My partner and I have started some initiatives around food systems, food growing and food distribution in our largely multicultural community.
And your training is in the arts, of course. I think you're both a curator, a writer, wear many hats.
Yeah.
What was your PhD in?
My PhD was it was art in the Anthropocene, processes of responsiveness and communication in an era of environmental uncertainty. And, that was like work from 2010 to 2015. And, like we weren't talking about the Anthropocene. I remember back then having quite a bit of pushback from educators and academics on the validity of this research. I had a curator say to me, "This isn't art, this is political," and now, it has become quite valid in the art circles, especially in Australia, and I'm understanding in Canada as well.
Well, we'll start with the question I'm asking all of my guests about the idea of accepting reality, which has a relationship to denial, but also how you interpret reality, and the idea of ecological grief. And they're different things, but for me, I'm exploring them in parallel because I've needed to do both to really come to terms with what I think is real, what is scientifically true, but also true in my body, and to work through ecological grief. So what are some of the thoughts on that? Cultural theorist Thomas Berry. Our challenge is to create a new language, even a new sense of what it is to be human. It is to transcend not only national limitations, but even our species' isolation, to enter into the larger community of living species. This brings about a completely new sense of reality and value.
Yeah, I think I've been in that, fluctuating in all of those different stages for a long time, and I always prepare myself for the next IPCC report to be able to deal with all of the complex emotions that come out when you get that hit with such difficult news to digest. But I've been in that acceptance space since 2006. 2005. I remember it was the death of my father and the birth of my daughter that it was a big reality check, and understanding that he had a lot of skills and knowledges that I didn't retain, and they were the sort of skills and knowledges that my daughter was going to need in the climate emergency. And I remember being in a creative lab at Arts House, and it was with climate scientists and sociologists and community workers, and for us to go and work on this big body of work called the Refuge Project, we consciously crossed a threshold where we said, climate change impacts are going to hit us, and we're no longer going to be in that space around raising awareness or doing work about, particular issues. We were going to cross a threshold together to really think about climate-related disasters and preparing for them. So moving into a preparedness mindset, and that became a really liberating experience to step in there, because all of a sudden we weren't caught in I guess those deep emotional states, and it was focusing on what we could do. And so I feel like I'm far more active and less crippled by emotions than I was, back in 2014, 15.
Well, I had an experience. You're part of a film called Refugium. You could maybe tell us a bit about that, because I really recommend that people see that. And what it did for me, because it's a type of speculative fiction, you can explain it, but what it did for me is free my mind, even though the future is problematic because we know what's coming in terms of climate disruption. It was also good to anticipate a future and many futures, and how that relates to action is sometimes a direct or indirect connection, but it certainly I got over the fear of the content of your work, of your film, the things you're writing, and it freed me to be more able to embrace the fact that these things are coming, and that we do have to prepare the way for our children, and that life is still here, it's still vital, it's still alive. But maybe you could tell a bit about that piece, and then also what speculative fiction or speculative type artworks can do for audiences. How does that? Where does that bring the audience member? Artist Diego Galafasi. Art is a space where we can ask very difficult questions and explore things in a more open-ended way, and not be committed to solutions.
Oh, well, thanks for that feedback. That film, we've just released it about a week and a half ago. So Refugium, that's it's a collaboration with author Noongar author Claire G. Coleman. She's responsible for a book in Australia called Terra Nullius. She works a lot in thinking around colonial impact on First Nations people, and we did a performance piece, sort of on the back of the Australian bushfires and pre-pandemic, and said, "Oh my goodness, we operate in the same zeitgeist. We should collaborate." And then the pandemic hit, and we couldn't collaborate. Like, we couldn't meet in person. So over the course of 2020, we met once a week and decided we were going to do a performance piece. And Claire was, living quite remotely from Melbourne, and I was living in a community that was impacted by COVID. I mean, literally on the other side of our fence, where we had 44 deaths. And, our daughter was in the backyard, and we had drones flying over. We had police, ambulances, and so forth. And through this writing, Claire and I realized that Claire could go into the dark spaces much faster than I could. And I was constantly pulling back, saying, I have to ensure that I don't traumatize my 4-year-old. And so that started a dialogue around thinking about intergenerational justice, and thinking about, how do we prevent trauma? Like, how do we have child-centered trauma prevention? And I mean, there wasn't a lot of literature on this. we started doing storylines. We did complicated storylines and timelines, thinking about different trajectories. Okay, what if we go down this one towards collapse? What if we go down to this one where there's a technological solution? And we started mapping different solutions, different ways, in terms of different ways in which we could think about the future. But the two main points were child-centered trauma prevention and intergenerational justice. And that's where we came up with essentially a Zoom call from the future, two people, because I mean, our entire relationship pretty much was in Zoom. And this storyboard became a dialogue between what became my future ancestor and what it would look like for myself to return to Canada, and what would push me to leave Australia. Like Australia is, I think, in the top three of biodiversity loss. We had unbelievable bushfires, and I mean, yes, the pandemic we're not experiencing it in the way in which the rest of the world are now. But if we have another year like we had with the bushfires, I mean, Australia, it's a dire situation thinking about that, and very conservative thinking. We've got great disparity between the rich and the poor. We've got massive ecological degradation. The reality is that Australia may become unlivable within my daughter's lifetime, and maybe we are in that privileged place where we could leave. So so I think in terms of speculative fiction, I call myself a pragmatic futurist. I think a lot about preparing myself for what might come. And what we've learned in the Refuge Project, and the Refuge Project is a project by Arts House in Melbourne, and it's where art meets the climate emergency, and it's a transdisciplinary collaborative project where we have artists, community groups, local governments, emergency service professionals, all collaborating together, imagining different sorts of disaster scenarios. We've done a flood, a heat wave, a pandemic in 2018, ironically, and we've been looking at climate-related displacement for the last couple of years. The thing about a preparedness mindset is that you are thinking into the future, and so if one of those scenarios happens, you've already mentally prepared in some sort of way for it. So you're not dealing with the shock, right? And so that's a place as an artist that I feel has a lot of potential, right, for engagement and for communication and bringing audiences along.
And so how does that work aesthetically? What does the audience member experience when they are in a pragmatic futurist artwork?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the experience of working in Refuge, and predominantly all of my work now, I don't really have dress rehearsals. I'm not about creating a perfect work for the audience. I'm interested in bringing the audience along in an experimental process. And even our community-based work is like that as well. So it allows the audience to come in and help shape the work at the same time. And it's in that vein of perpetual responsiveness. And I feel like in COVID, in the COVID response, at least in our community and with a lot of people that I've spoken to, people rolled up their sleeves, right? And they didn't have all of the perfect answers, but they started to adapt and experiment together. And that's perpetual responsiveness. Yeah.
In a participative, community engaged model, I mean, those words are very broad, but I hear you, because if you're not a passive audience member, you're actually able to voice or at least participate in an artwork, then you're in a way creating your own future, thinking about it, going through the emotions of, and obviously you don't want to necessarily have those things to happen. And it is a call to action, but it's not necessarily an immediate action. It's like a reflective action. It's like, who am I? Where am I going? What kind of world do I want my children to inherit? I find it's very complex, and that's why the complexity of the arts are so interesting, I think, in climate around climate issues, because it kind of can work its way in and around some of the most obvious facts, fact. Yeah, well, how do you feel about it? It inspires you also. So Jen, I'm interested in all of your work, because I was listening to a podcast you did this afternoon. I was driving the car. It's called Raising the Bar, and it was from 2009. And I recommend people listen to that as well, because we won't get through all the things you said. But one of the things you said is you quoted Susie Gablick, who I've been reading for years. I've never met her, but who was talking about she used the word egocentric nature of artists. Not that only artists are egocentric. I think everybody is in society, but that she was implying that was a barrier. And will the arts step up? And I mention it because it triggered something in me I hadn't thought about, because I tend to think, art is good. Art will step up. But art has a lot of the same barriers that other parts of society has, right? We're materialistic. We live in a consumer society. Artists are often more socially sensible, and they certainly work with less material. But I don't know why, if you have thoughts about that particular quote, but also some of the barriers that the arts community and some of the opportunities also for the arts community coming into a more intense climate crisis. How do you see the role of the arts, and how do you see some of the ways that artists can adapt to these new circumstances? Artist Lance Garavi. While individual works of art, however genius, may have value, they won't do the trick. What we need is for all art to be about climate change.
C'est un peu comme quand on prend une grenouille qui est un animal à sang froid et qu'on la met dans un bocal d'eau et qu'on fait chauffer l'eau peu à peu. La grenouille va s'habituer à la
Composer Robert Normando.
Jusqu'à la mort.
It's a bit like taking a frog, which is a cold-blooded animal, and putting it into a jar of water and heating the water, little by little.
Sur le plan sonore,
the frog will get used to the temperature rising and rising, and it will not notice that the temperature has risen. And one day, the temperature will be too hot for it, and it will die. Therefore, our civilization, in terms of sound, looks a bit like that. That is to say, we get used to it, we get used to it, we get used to it, and at some point, we're going to have punctured eardrums.
Yeah, I think that one of those things around the egocentric role there that lots of artists find themselves in, a way to think about this is that you can make really brilliant work about in relation to the climate emergency, but oftentimes you're presenting this work to discrete audiences in sort of privileged settings, and you're preaching to the converted, right? The arts, artists have a lot of different skills. We're very used to collaborating with new collaborators or people outside of our bubble. And, I think if we, we as artists, as well as people outside of the arts, if we actually did a skills audit, look at all the different skills and knowledges that we have, and if we can find ways to connect them with others, these are survival skills, essentially, as artists. In the climate emergency, we're going to see, the ways in which we're already seeing it in COVID, but, the way in which we tour, the way in which we present, the residencies, all the ways in which we make art and disseminate it, it's going to change in the climate emergency, right? That makes us quite vulnerable. But if we can find ways to look at how our skills and knowledges intersect within other disciplines, and finding really dynamic ways in which we can collaborate and amplify those skills, we can continue to be dynamic in the climate emergency. But if we hold on to these institutions or these ways of working that we've had for decades, it's not going to be there. And I think when you're talking about realities, accepting that reality, right, I think will, has the potential to push us to do other things. It's great to hear about Canada Council, changing different ways around enabling the arts and building capacity in the arts in terms of the context of the climate emergency. It'll be interesting to see how artists step up.
Are you seeing artists step up in Australia, France, for example?
I think things are very similar here. We have seen funding to support artists in the COVID response, or artworks, the creation of artworks in the climate response. We're seeing a lot of artists come and step up to the table, and I think that that's important. If we think of things like a choir, there have been some singers in the climate space for a really long time, and it's great to have new voices. But I think one of the things that's really important for artists who are engaging in sort of in the climate context is to understand in many ways that they're situated within a field, right? And climate change is so complex. You don't have to know all of the different details, but I think it's really important to collaborate to move beyond sort of your individual response to a particular issue, but to gain, a more complex or broader understanding of what you're engaging with. And just one other note on that, I think the role of mentoring is really important right now, and experimenting. And I think anyone who's been working in this space, it would be great to bring others along into the conversation and make sure that everyone has their legs under the same table, because we do need intergenerational knowledge. We need knowledge from, all different intersections of our communities, so that we do get that broad understanding, because it took all the skills and knowledges to get us into this place. It's going to take all of the skills and knowledges to help get us out of it, or to get us into whatever sort of survival space that we might need to be in the future.
Well, it's, I think, relatively new for artists to be talking about survival space. Some of the language you use, I think, will become more and more common, but it's really useful for artists to think about that. That not only COVID, but the combination of COVID and the climate crisis have created new circumstances that are essentially moving towards a survivalist type approach to living on Earth, right? It's come to that. You said, Australia might be 2 generations away from being uninhabitable or less habitable. People aren't there yet. A lot of people around me are. I don't necessarily think they're in denial. I just think they're not able to process the level of danger that we're in, that we put ourselves in.
Philosophy professor Todd Dufresne. We're all being radicalized by reality. It's just that for some people, it takes a personal experience of fire, landslide, or hurricane to get their attention. I'm afraid it takes mass death and extinction. Whoever survives these experiences will have a renewed appreciation for nature, for the external world, and for the necessity of collectivism in the face of mass extinction.
And that's why I tried to accept reality, but it sounds a little glib, accept reality, but I really tried to understand, IPCC reports and others, to let it sink in, and I have a 19-year-old daughter and a 23-year-old son. We talk about this all the time, about how their generation are going to inherit what we've left, and we've left some good things. There's some great inventions, but they're all short term. The capital is the resource space. The whole disconnection from nature, all that ideology, not ideology. It's what's happened. It's like our heritage, what we're passing on. I think has to be not more of the old, but a lot of maybe the very old, if you think about Indigenous knowledge, but also that combination of resources. So maybe we can talk a bit. I know you've listened to the Seth Klein episode, because he's set up in Vancouver with the David Suzuki Institute and others a thing called the Emergency Climate Unit, and his idea is that the arts can play a much larger role in somehow rallying people to engage in an emergency mode with the climate emergency or with the climate issue. What are your thoughts? What did you think when you heard him speak? And as a Canadian, you can see this coming out of Western Canada, where there's a very strong environmental movement. What are your thoughts on that?
Here would be my challenge to artists today, and maybe to you too, Claude. So we're beginning to see artists across many artistic domains producing climate and climate emergency art, which is important and good to see. What's striking to me is most of it, in the main, is dystopian about how horrific the world will be if we fail to rise to this moment. And to a certain extent, that makes sense, right? Because it is scary and horrific. But here's what intrigued me about the artists, what artists were producing in the war, is that in the main, it was not dystopian, even though the war was horrific. It was rallying us. The tone was rallying us. Similar, I found myself listening to this music as I was doing the research, and I was thinking, wow, okay, World War II had a popular soundtrack, and the anti-Vietnam War had a popular soundtrack. And when I was a kid in the peace and disarmament movement, there was a popular soundtrack. This doesn't have a popular soundtrack yet.
Well, I thought there were some really valid points, that he made, around the fact that we don't have an anthem, for the climate emergency, and in questioning, why that's the case, and making a case for, a call to arms, essentially, of the arts, stepping up to the plate. I do get alarmed, though, when I do hear, and increasingly so, around using war language in terms of the climate emergency. And we had a national summit here, and on the climate emergency last year, before the COVID lockdowns, and that was the dominant language. And the thing is that that language is a command and control language, and it doesn't come from a place of empathy. It doesn't come from a place of togetherness, or, Claire in the film Refugeum talks about, in times of volatility, she refers to Plato, in times of volatility, that mankind descends into tyranny. That's war language. I find that highly problematic. I think when we can focus on social cohesion, social inclusion, and thinking about justice, I think we're appealing to a different heart, within our humanity. And so, and that comes from, a lot of this is First Nations knowledge, and thinking about the eternal now, that we're thinking about our ancestors, past, present, and emerging, and thinking about their safety and their well-being and their prosperity. So I see what Seth is saying, like he's giving an example of a time in which there was, a great mobilization of the arts. And I understand about this dystopian, sort of trajectory that a lot of the arts are moving towards. But World War II, we didn't have social media, and we didn't have, people constantly connected, and the world was, vastly different, and less connected now, less stressed. I would think, we're stressed by information, and our time is pulled in all different directions, and we have this notion that you know, I guess I've been trying to unpack this lately around abundance, like this myth that we don't have abundance, and yet, yeah,
We have cultural abundance.
we have cultural abundance, but we also have this sort of thinking that we don't have enough as well, and so we're always sort of moving, trying to fill that gap, or that that we're not good enough, or all of those different things. And
well, that topic has come up in conversations, previous episodes, about what is enough, and certainly in certain cultures, you take no more than you need, and you leave. And I think we have an insatiable appetite for newness and materials, and in fact, we don't need that much. We need a roof. We need family. We need, or social circles there to be happy. And now it's true that in Canada and in Australia, we're very privileged countries because we don't have war. We don't have some of the challenges. But I think that's something to explore: is what is enough, and when do we stop, and when do we just be happy with the things that are important to us, and not have that endless desire to go further.
This is just reminding me of an undergraduate class that I had at the University of Alberta with Dr. Anne Whitelaw, and it was the birth of or something to do with like the origins of advertising, and it went back to World War. I remember her talking about World War II, World War One, around the birth of advertising, and around razors and soap. Where people were told that they were unclean, and therefore you had to buy, I think it was Pear soap, or you have too much hair, therefore, these razors are, what you need. We've, for the last 100 years, we've been trapped in all of these sorts of, these stories and myths that we've been sold. And we've moved into very much a consumptive mindset rather than a productive one. And when we're in a productive mindset, we are in the creative mindset, right? And we are happy with enough, and we are constantly, in problem solving mode and so forth. But when we're in a consumptive mode, we're only looking at our deficit, and yeah, I think there's something quite powerful in that. And there was a really great thing that the World Wildlife Fund produced called Weathercocks and Signposts, and this was probably in 2008. They did research in America on the side of the house that people placed their solar panels, and they found that more people placed their solar panels on the street-facing side of their house than the side of the house that actually would receive the most amount of sunlight. And what was interesting in that research was that it brought into play sort of how the social dynamic of decision making and peer pressure and so forth, and to be seen as being eco-minded. And so I think there's a lot there in terms of fodder for us to think about in terms of how do we create sort of systemic change. And Ingrid Wynne-Jones, in that same podcast with Raising the Bar, she did one on raising a movement or causing a movement. And I recommend that one. How do you create movements? And she's done that in the arts in Australia for decades. Yeah, one of the other things that sort of struck me with Seth's podcast was around how Western-centric the perspective was. And I don't think that other cultures experienced a similar sort of feeling about World War II. And so I think it's important when we're thinking about the narratives around the climate emergency that we don't situate ourselves within Western narratives, that we think about other cultures that have been experiencing climate impacts for decades, or think about First Nations perspectives where they have dealt with massive climate events in their histories, in their ancestors' histories. So I mean, that's just something I think as a form of reference in terms of that language around calling upon those stories, that it is quite problematic in many ways.
Well, I think what Seth is doing is using the Second World War effort as a sort of an allegory of scale, right? That's how large it needs to be. Obviously, it's a different context, but I think people have to fill in the gaps, and contribute to what that effort needs to be and how it needs to be done. The just transition is an example, but I think all those ideas are coming now.
I think there's greater examples than that, though, Claude. I think Rachel Carson's fable in the beginning of Silent Spring is an excellent one. It used a language that appealed to women in households. Stories that, I mean, even Al Gore references his mother talking about Silent Spring at the dinner table. The freedom songs of the apartheid movement, that were a way of disseminating information. There's quite a few of them. There's, I'm just trying to think of the one that started the Environmental Protection Agency in America. That was a song that started, that appealed to Americans to protect their rivers. Dickens, his stories, how they stopped, I got people to understand the problems around the child labor, that it sparked the child labor movements. So I think there are other examples that we can draw from that don't involve war, that really think about empathy and storytelling, and that don't evoke violence, and even though I know these were rallying calls and so forth, they still are embedded in violence and a Western perspective.
Well, it's good to debate these things. Thank you for that, those perspectives. Yeah, and what about representation and inclusion? You were just talking. We were talking about the idea of volunteer driven activities, but how do we make sure that all the voices are heard when we're doing this kind of work?
Yeah, when you're working oftentimes in volunteer capacities, you are often attracting, people who have free time, to contribute. And if you really want to be inclusive, you do have to honor, the time of others. And when you're having volunteers, you're often attracting sort of more privileged classes who have, more free time. If you are remunerating and inviting people from, different cultural backgrounds, young people, people with different disabilities and so forth, remunerating them for their time is also saying, we value your voice, right? And so I think that it's an important part of discussion around inclusion and equity that we need to be having to make sure that we are inviting and remunerating and valuing the voices of others, the skills and knowledges that are often overlooked and undervalued.
I want to end our conversation because we literally could go on a long time, but we'll just want to end with what advice you have, because I know many artists and cultural workers listen to these kinds of podcasts, and I'm trying to help those who are interested to better understand, what they can do in a practical way. What advice have you for artists who want to become more engaged in climate issues or even survival issues? What are some of the barriers or some of the things that you think they should be doing to be able to move to literally transition the practice from maybe a more conventional practice to one that's more engaged with the climate emergency?
Yeah, I mean, do a skills audit. I think that's a beginning, to think about what are the skills and knowledges that you have that you can share. I think engage, attend as much as you possibly can, where, there are opportunities to collaborate. Think about your own community, especially right now, more than anything, think about how your skills and knowledges can help bolster community resilience in the climate emergency. One of the things that we know from our work in the Refuge Project is that you're more likely to be helped out in a disaster context by your own neighbor than you are by emergency services. So understanding your capacity and knowing your neighbor and knowing, what you can contribute is one way. And don't reinvent the wheel, right? See how, your work can amplify the work of others. And then, if you focus your work on relationships, right, that great project might be 3 years down the road, and you might have a great team of collaborators to work on it, and you might make, significant impact in your community. And then, disseminate your outcomes from that. But that would probably, finding alternative audiences and social, being more inclusive of the voices of others, I think, are the most important things, because it is that thing that I mentioned, it's going to take all the skills and knowledges to help us find a way out of this mess.
Dharma teacher Catherine Ingram. Despite having caused so much destruction, it is important to consider the wide spectrum of possibilities that make up human life. Yes, on one end of that spectrum is greed, cruelty, and ignorance. On the other end is kindness, compassion, and wisdom. We are imbued with great creativity, brilliant communication, and extraordinary appreciation of and talent for music and other forms of art. There is no other known creature whose spectrum of consciousness is as wide and varied as our own.
Is there anything else you wanted to say before we wrap up?
So one of the things that we asked in the Refuge Project was, what do you know that you don't know that you know that we all might need to know in a disaster, right? And that's, it's a question that can stump you, but then once you actually start to think about it, you might recall, something that your grandmother taught you, and you might not remember the exact details of how to do it, but you can start to unpack some of the elements of it. And, it could be things like simple building skills. It might be remembering how your grandmother spoke to strangers in her community, or the fact that, how to, it could be media training, it could be anything, but, it's starting to unpack all of those things that, that have potential, that we need to hold on to in order to pass on to others and share that knowledge, and to get rid of paywalls, and to make a public pedagogy of survival skills and ways of being in the world that aren't a currency or capitalistic in any sort of way.
Well, that's a good advice, and it's a good question. I'll put that in the program notes and make it a suggestion that I certainly will do it myself, because it's I like that question, just to be able to think about what are some of the resources and some of the memories and some of the not that right now we're in an emergency, right? The COVID crisis, depending where you are in the world, is for some it's a disaster, and for everyone it's an emergency. So already there, we could do some self-reflection on what we've experienced, what we've learned, how we can build on that going forward, and still, create beautiful art, still have great, great experiences. That's one thing we won't get into so much, but it's to get out of a negative mindset, right? Even though what's coming is problematic, like I said. How can we retain, I don't know if the word hope is appropriate, but some level of positivity about the moment that we're in, and how we want to live our lives going forward, whenever it might end.
Yeah. We just, besides, the Refugeum film, I had a project called Portage Shelter to Camp that happened the week before. And I was collaborating with 4 First Nations master weavers. And we were looking at vernacular architecture and Indigenous forms of building. And we built 6 disaster shelters based on a Papua New Guinean stilt house, which, is a great design for if you're living in floodplains. There was a Somalian Akal, there's a Gunjamara stone house, a Métis wigwam, and a lean-to. And we invited over 100 people to come co-build with us over 4.5 days. And we had an idea what we wanted to build. We had all of the materials, but not one of us could actually build any of these structures. And, this is our second iteration. We built boats in 2019. Here, we had all of these materials, and it was everyone who showed up to the workshop, they learned a certain skill that was replicated and then scaled up. But, it was one man who came in and showed us different types of lashing that ended up building one structure. And then it was somebody else that could, make one of our binding techniques more efficient. And we, when at the end of the days of the co-building, we were probably, we way surpassed, what we thought we would be building. And it was just because the people who showed up, part of it, so much of this is about showing up. We ended up building 6 life-size structures in the main hall at Arts House, and it was, the person who showed us the lashing, he ended up coming 3 days in a row because he was just saying, oh my God, this is great. I'm no longer sitting behind my computer. I'm meeting with people and I'm co-building in a way in which we're talking about other things by doing a repetitious action. And, I'd like to be doing more work like that in the future because it just seems like it just reminds us why we're alive in many ways, meeting new people and just seeing, what we have to contribute. And it's exciting.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you, Jen Rae, for speaking with me today, and we'll keep in touch.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you so much.